The old Franklin Manor had been a source of whispered stories for decades. Perched on a desolate hill in rural Maine, its decaying facade seemed to exhale an air of despair. For over 50 years, no one dared live there. The rumors were too grim, the disappearances too real. Yet, when Sarah Mitchell inherited the estate from a distant relative, she dismissed the warnings as nothing more than backwoods folklore. Determined to restore the mansion, Sarah moved in alone, armed with little more than her skepticism and a flashlight. From the moment she crossed the threshold, the air inside seemed heavier, colder. The grand staircase stretched upward like the spine of some great beast, its wooden steps groaning beneath her feet. Dust swirled in the dim light, disturbed only by her presence. She chalked up her unease to the isolation. The first night passed without incident, though she found herself waking frequently to the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway outside her bedroom. She told herself it was the house settling or a draft sneaking through its ancient bones. But by the second night, the sounds grew louder. Doors creaked open and slammed shut, though none were visibly moving. Objects she'd left on the counter would vanish, only to reappear in strange places. She could feel the eyes, unseen but constant, their gaze prickling the back of her neck. By the third night, Sarah decided to record everything. She set up her phone on a tripod in the living room, leaving it running while she slept. The next morning, she reviewed the footage. At first, nothing seemed amiss, but then she saw it. A shadow gliding across the room. It wasn't the flicker of a curtain or the trick of the light. It had form, intent. And then it stopped directly in front of the camera, as if staring back at her through the screen. Sarah was shaken, but resolute. She contacted a local historian, hoping to learn more about the manor's past. What she discovered chilled her to the core. In 1893, the Franklin family had lived there, including their youngest daughter, Eleanor. Eleanor was said to have been gifted or cursed with the ability to communicate with spirits. Her parents, devoutly religious, accused her of witchcraft. The townsfolk stormed the manor one fateful night, dragging Eleanor to the basement, where she was tied to a chair and left for days without food or water. She died there, her spirit never leaving the place of her torment. That night, armed with the knowledge of Eleanor's tragic fate, Sarah ventured into the basement. The air was suffocating, thick with an oppressive energy. The faint scent of burning wax filled her nostrils, though there were no candles. She shone her flashlight around the space until it landed on something that made her blood run cold. The chair, its wooden frame splintered and stained, still stood in the center of the room. She called out, her voice trembling. "Eleanor, if you're here, I want to help you." At first, there was nothing. Then a low, guttural moan reverberated through the room. The temperature plummeted. The flashlight flickered, casting jagged shadows across the walls. Suddenly, Sarah felt a searing pain on her arm, as if something had scratched her. She fled the basement, her breath coming in gasps. In the days that followed, the activity escalated. Lights turned on and off by themselves. Whispers filled the air, unintelligible but unmistakable. The scratches on Sarah's arm grew worse, forming crude, deliberate letters. Leavv. Terrified but unwilling to give up, she sought out a medium. The woman, a seasoned clairvoyant, agreed to cleanse the house. As the medium walked through the manor, she stopped in the living room, her eyes wide with alarm. "She's here," the medium whispered, "but she's not alone." The cleansing began with the medium chanting prayers and burning sage. At first, it seemed to work. The air felt lighter. But then a deafening bang echoed through the house, and the walls themselves seemed to shudder. The medium screamed, her voice merging with another, a shrill, inhuman wail. A shadowy figure emerged from the corner of the room, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. It lunged towards Sarah, who collapsed to the floor in terror. When Sarah awoke, she was outside, the medium shaking her violently. The house was silent, its windows dark. "It's done," the medium said, though her voice was filled with uncertainty. Sarah never returned to Franklin Manor. Within a month, the house burned to the ground, the cause unknown. But even now, late at night, Sarah swears she can hear Eleanor's voice whispering her name, beckoning her back to the place where nightmares began. The Hollow Grove was a patch of forest notorious among locals for its peculiar silence. No birds sang there, no crickets chirped, not even the wind seemed to touch the gnarled trees. Nestled at its heart was the hollow well, a crumbling stone structure surrounded by legends of cursed water and ghostly apparitions. Most avoided the place entirely. But not Aaron. Aaron was an amateur paranormal investigator who thrived on fear. He had heard the tales of the well, a young girl drowned there in the 1800s, her spirit supposedly haunting the grove, and decided it would be the perfect spot for his next exploration. Armed with his camera, flashlight, and recorder, he set out alone on a cold October night. The path into the grove was narrow, the trees on either side crowding in like looming shadows. The deeper he went, the quieter it became, as though the forest were holding its breath. By the time he reached the well, the silence was absolute. The structure was more decrepit than he'd imagined, its stones covered in moss and strange, dark stains. He peered over the edge, his flashlight beam barely penetrating the black void below. "Is anyone here?" Aaron called out, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. For a moment there was nothing. Then came the faint sound of dripping water from the depths of the well. Encouraged, Aaron set up his camera and recorder, repeating his questions. As he waited for a response, he noticed something odd. The air around him seemed to grow colder, his breath visible in the beam of his flashlight. And then he heard it. A soft, wet gurgle, like someone choking. He leaned closer to the well, his heart pounding. "If you're here, show yourself," he whispered. The gurgling sound grew louder, accompanied by a faint rustling from within the well. Aaron aimed his flashlight straight down, straining to see. At first there was nothing but darkness, but then two pale hands emerged, gripping the edge of the well. The fingers were thin and impossibly long, the nails blackened and cracked. Slowly, a face followed, white as bone, with hollow eyes that seemed to absorb all light. Its mouth hung open, revealing rows of jagged black teeth. Aaron stumbled back, tripping over a root and dropping his flashlight. Darkness enveloped him, and the sound of scraping stone filled the air as the figure began to climb out of the well. Desperate, he grabbed his flashlight and shone it toward the well, only to find it empty. The pale figure was gone, his breathing ragged. Aaron grabbed his equipment and bolted. But the forest didn't want to let him leave. The trees seemed closer than before, their branches clawing at him as he ran. The path twisted and turned in ways it hadn't when he entered, leading him in circles. And all the while, he heard the faint gurgle behind him, growing closer. When he finally burst out of the grove, gasping and covered in scratches, the relief was short-lived. In his rush to escape, he had left his camera behind. Determined to prove his experience wasn't just a figment of his imagination, he returned the next morning with friends. But when they reached the well, the camera was gone. In its place, they found Aaron's flashlight and a single object, a locket. He picked it up, opening it with trembling hands. Inside was a photograph of a young girl, her expression eerily blank. Beneath the photo was an inscription, Elizabeth, 1862. That night, Aaron awoke to the sound of dripping water. He sat up in bed, his chest tight with fear. His room was freezing, despite the heater running. And there, at the foot of his bed, stood the figure from the well, its hollow eyes locked onto his, its mouth opening wider than should have been possible. The last thing Aaron heard before everything went dark was the sound of gurgling water. When his friends came looking for him the next day, Aaron was gone. His bed was soaked, the sheets muddy, and the locket sat on his pillow. The old Eastwood Sanitarium had been abandoned for decades, its crumbling walls and shattered windows a stark reminder of its grim history. The locals whispered about the horrors that took place there, the cruel experiments, the endless screams, and the patients who were never seen again. Yet, for years, no one dared to enter, not even vandals. The stories of ghostly figures roaming the halls and disembodied screams had kept intruders at bay. Until a group of thrill-seeking friends decided to test their courage. There were 5 of them: Matt, Chloe, Lisa, Ben, and Rachel. They arrived at dusk, the sun casting long shadows over the decaying structure. Armed with flashlights, cameras, and a Ouija board, they joked nervously as they climbed through a broken window into the main hall. The air inside was damp and suffocating, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something metallic like blood. "Let's head to the operating room," Matt suggested, his bravado masking a flicker of fear. "That's where they say the worst stuff happened." The others agreed, their footsteps echoing ominously in the empty corridors. The deeper they ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Strange markings covered the walls, symbols and phrases in a language none of them recognized. Some looked fresh, the paint glistening faintly in the dim light. When they finally reached the operating room, they found an old, rusted table in the center. Instruments, scalpels, clamps, saws were scattered around as if the doctors had left in a hurry. Above the table, a single light fixture hung by a frayed wire, swaying slightly even though there was no breeze. Rachel placed the Ouija board on the table, her hands trembling. "Let's do this and get out of here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They gathered around, placing their fingers on the planchette. Chloe was the first to speak. "Is anyone here with us?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then the planchette began to move, slowly and deliberately, spelling out, "Y-E-S." Lisa laughed nervously. "Okay, who's messing with it?" "I'm not," Ben said, his face pale. The others nodded in agreement. Chloe swallowed hard. "What's your name?" The planchette moved again, faster this time. "E-L-I-Z-E. Rachel's voice shook. "Were you a patient here?" "Y-E-S. "What happened to you?" Matt asked. The board went still. Suddenly, the light above them flickered, casting erratic shadows across the room. A loud bang echoed from the hallway, followed by the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. "Did you hear that?" Ben hissed. Before anyone could answer, the planchette flew off the board, skittering across the floor. The temperature in the room plummeted, their breath visible in the dim light. And then they saw her. A figure stood in the corner, her white hospital gown stained with dark, rusty streaks. Her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her hollow eyes staring at them with malevolent intensity. Her mouth opened wide, wider than seemed humanly possible, releasing a guttural scream that shook the walls. The group scattered in panic, running blindly through the labyrinth of hallways. The screams followed them, echoing and multiplying as if the entire building had come alive. Chloe tripped and fell, her flashlight rolling into the darkness. When she scrambled to her feet, she was alone. "Guys," she called, her voice breaking. The only response was the sound of dragging footsteps coming closer. The others made it to the exit, breathless and trembling. They turned back, expecting to see Chloe behind them, but she was nowhere in sight. "We have to go back for her," Lisa said, tears streaming down her face. Before they could decide, the doors slammed shut with a deafening clang, locking them out. From inside, they heard Chloe's blood-curdling scream, followed by silence. The group called the police, but when they arrived, Chloe was gone. Inside, they found her flashlight and the Ouija board, the planchette now resting on a single word, M-I-N-ing. Chloe was never found, and the others were haunted by nightmares of the figure they saw that night. Sometimes late at night, they swore they could hear her voice calling to them, begging for help. There was an old stretch of road outside of town known as Raven's Hollow. It wound through a dense forest where sunlight never seemed to reach, even during the day. The road had a reputation. No one who drove it after midnight ever came back the same, or came back at all. For years, the disappearances were dismissed as urban legend, until one night when Claire decided to find out the truth. She wasn't afraid of ghost stories, and after a fight with her boyfriend, she needed to clear her head. The long, dark road seemed like the perfect escape. The night was eerily quiet as she drove, the headlights of her car barely cutting through the dense fog that clung to the asphalt. The trees on either side of the road were tall and twisted, their gnarled branches stretching out like skeletal hands. Claire felt a chill despite the heater blasting in her car. She turned on the radio to break the silence, but all she got was static. As she rounded a curve, her headlights caught a figure standing in the middle of the road, a woman in a tattered white dress, her hair hanging in limp strands around her face. Claire slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop mere feet from the woman. Claire rolled down her window slightly. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman didn't respond. She just stood there, her head slowly tilting to one side as if studying Claire. Against her better judgment, Claire opened the door and stepped out. "Hey, are you hurt?" The woman raised her head, and Claire's stomach dropped. The face staring back at her wasn't human. Its features were distorted, the eyes sunken and glowing faintly in the darkness. The woman opened her mouth and a low, guttural sound escaped, a noise that made Claire's blood run cold. Claire scrambled back into her car, slamming the door and locking it. She threw the car into reverse, but the woman was suddenly gone. Heart pounding, she glanced in her rearview mirror and froze. The woman was now sitting in the back seat, her glowing eyes meeting Claire's in the mirror. Claire screamed and floored the gas pedal, the car lurching forward. She didn't dare look back again, her only focus on getting off Raven's Hollow as quickly as possible. But the road seemed endless, twisting and turning in impossible ways. The woman's reflection appeared in the windshield, her face impossibly close despite being in the back seat. "You shouldn't have come here," the woman whispered, her voice like dry leaves scraping against glass. Claire screamed again and swerved, the car skidding off the road and slamming into a tree. When she came to, the car was empty. The woman was gone. Dazed and bleeding, Claire stumbled out and onto the road. In the distance, she saw headlights approaching, a relief that was short-lived. As the car drew closer, it didn't slow down. Instead, it passed right through her, vanishing into the fog. Claire looked down at herself, realizing her hands were translucent, her feet barely touching the ground. She was still on Raven's Hollow, but she wasn't alive anymore. To this day, travelers on that cursed road sometimes ring a woman standing by the roadside, her face obscured by shadows. They say she raises a hand as if asking for help. But if you stop, she'll lead you into the fog and you'll never leave Raven's Hollow again. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, there was an old mining town called Black Hollow. The town had been abandoned for decades after a collapse buried dozens of miners alive. No one ever retrieved the bodies, and the mine was sealed, left to the restless spirits of those who had perished. But the locals whispered about strange lights flickering in the hills at night, and voices carried on the wind calling for help. Sam and his friends, Jake and Alina, were amateur ghost hunters. When they heard about Black Hollow, they decided to spend a night there, armed with cameras and recording equipment. The trip was supposed to be a thrill, a harmless exploration of an old ghost story. But what they found would haunt them forever. The group arrived at dusk, the skeletal remains of the town barely visible through the encroaching fog. The buildings were crumbling, overtaken by moss and vines. The mine entrance loomed at the edge of town, its boarded-up facade marked with faded warnings, "Do not enter." "This is it," Sam said, his voice tinged with excitement. "Let's set up." They started with the town's remains, wandering through the ruins as night fell. The air was unnaturally still, their footsteps echoing too loudly. In what had once been the saloon, Jake picked up a strange sound on his recorder, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It grew louder when they played it back, like someone hammering deep underground. "This is amazing," Sam said, oblivious to Elena's growing unease. By the time they reached the mine entrance, the fog had thickened, wrapping around them like a shroud. The tapping sound followed them, growing fainter, but never ceasing. Sam pried away the rotting boards covering the entrance, revealing a gaping black maw that seemed to swallow their flashlight beams. "Are you sure about this?" Elena asked, her voice trembling. "We didn't come all this way to chicken out," Sam replied, stepping into the mine. The air inside was cold and damp, carrying the metallic scent of earth and rust. Their flashlights illuminated narrow, crumbling tunnels, the walls streaked with black veins of coal. The further they went, the more oppressive the darkness became, pressing in around them. Suddenly, Jake stopped. "Did you hear that?" The group froze, straining to listen. From deep within the mine came a faint voice, a man's voice, calling out, "Help me, please." Elena grabbed Sam's arm. "We need to leave. Now." "It could be someone in trouble," Sam argued, though his own fear was evident. Against her protests, they moved deeper into the mine, following the voice. It grew louder, more desperate, until it sounded as though the person was just ahead. They turned a corner and stopped in their tracks. There, in the flickering beam of their flashlights, stood a man covered in soot and dirt. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, and his clothes were tattered. "Help me," he rasped, his voice echoing unnaturally. Then he stepped forward, and they saw his legs, broken and twisted at impossible angles, yet he moved as if unbothered. Sam stumbled back, and the man's head snapped toward him, his mouth opening wide to emit a guttural scream that filled the tunnel. The walls seemed to tremble, dust and debris raining down as the sound reverberated. From the darkness behind the man came more figures, miners with hollow eyes, their bodies grotesquely mangled, crawling and dragging themselves toward the group. "Run!" Elena screamed. They turned and bolted, the tunnel twisting in ways it hadn't before. The flashlight beams flickered, the batteries draining rapidly. The voices of the miners grew louder, closer, their cries overlapping in a cacophony of agony. Elena tripped, falling hard to the ground. Jake stopped to help her, but as he reached down, something grabbed his leg, yanking him into the darkness. His scream was cut short. Elena scrambled to her feet, tears streaming down her face, and she and Sam ran without looking back. They burst out of the mine just as the first rays of dawn broke through the fog. Behind them, the entrance was sealed again, as if it had never been opened. Jake was gone. Elena and Sam returned to town, but their story was met with skepticism. The mine was checked, but no signs of disturbance were found. The authorities dismissed Jake's disappearance as an accident or a prank gone wrong. But Elena knew the truth. She never went near Black Hollow again, and sometimes in the dead of night she would hear it. A faint tapping sound, growing louder, and Jake's voice calling out from somewhere deep below, begging for help. The Whispering House was the kind of place you only heard about in hushed tones, usually over a campfire or in the dark corners of a bar. Nestled at the end of a desolate road, it had been abandoned for nearly a century. No one knew why the last family had fled so suddenly, leaving everything behind. But everyone in town agreed on one thing. No one who spent a night there ever came out the same. Lila had always been drawn to the macabre. She'd heard the stories about the house growing up, and now, at 25, she wanted to prove them wrong. Armed with a backpack, her phone, and a sense of defiance, she set out on a cold November evening. The house stood like a rotting corpse, its windows shattered, its paint peeled away to reveal the blackened wood beneath. The front door hung ajar as if beckoning her inside. Lila hesitated, the air around her heavy with silence, but curiosity pushed her forward. Inside, the house was unnaturally cold. Dust coated every surface, and the furniture was frozen in time, as if the family had only stepped out for a moment. The smell of damp wood and mildew hung in the air. Lila's footsteps echoed too loudly as she moved from room to room, documenting everything with her phone. In the living room, she found an old piano with yellowed keys. Sitting on top was a family portrait, a man, a woman, and 2 children. Their faces were oddly blurred, like a photograph left out in the rain. She turned the frame over and found a date scratched into the wood. October 31st, 1923. Creepy, she muttered, setting it down. The first few hours passed uneventfully, though the oppressive silence began to wear on her. The house seemed to exhale around her, the walls creaking faintly as if adjusting to her presence. She set up her sleeping bag in the living room and decided to record an EVP session, just for fun. "Is anyone here with me?" she asked, her voice steady. The room remained silent, but when she played back the recording, a faint whisper crackled through the speaker. "Leave." A shiver ran down her spine, but she brushed it off. Probably just interference, she told herself. As the night wore on, strange things began to happen. The sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs, though the floorboards were too rotted to hold weight. The piano played a single, discordant note, its keys untouched. Shadows danced at the edge of her vision, vanishing when she turned her head. At midnight, the temperature plummeted further. Her breath fogged in front of her as she pulled her sleeping bag tighter. Then she heard it, a voice, soft and childlike, coming from the hallway. "Come play with us." Her heart stopped. She grabbed her flashlight and shone it toward the doorway. Nothing. But the voice came again, closer this time. "Come play." Her flashlight flickered and went out. Panic set in as she fumbled with her phone for light. When it finally illuminated the room, she froze. Standing in the corner were 2 children, their faces obscured by shadows, their clothes tattered and faded, their heads tilted in unison as they stepped closer. Lila scrambled to her feet, backing away. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." The children's heads snapped toward her, their faces suddenly clear. Their eyes were hollow, their mouths stretched into unnatural smiles that split their faces. They opened their mouths in unison, but instead of words, a horrible, guttural scream erupted, shaking the walls. Lila ran, her feet slipping on the rotted floorboards. The house seemed to shift around her, the hallways stretching and twisting, trapping her in a maze of decayed wood and shadows. Doors slammed on their own, and that voice, "Come play with us," echoed endlessly in her ears. She finally found the front door and burst into the night, gasping for air. She didn't stop running until she reached her car. When she looked back, the house was dark, silent, and still. But in the upstairs window, she saw them. The 2 children, their hollow eyes watching her. Lila never spoke of that night, but she was never the same. Sometimes, late at night, she would wake to faint whispers in her room and the sound of a single piano note playing in the distance. There was a forgotten stretch of railway deep in the woods called the Widow's Line. Decades ago, a train had derailed there during a fierce storm, killing everyone aboard. The railway was abandoned, and the story faded into local lore. But those brave enough to walk the tracks at night claimed they could still hear the train whistle and see ghostly figures wandering the woods, searching for their final destination. James had heard the tales growing up. As a budding photographer with a taste for the eerie, he thought documenting the tracks on Halloween night would make for a great story, and maybe even launch his career. Armed with his camera and flashlight, he set off into the woods alone. The night was unnaturally quiet. No insects buzzed, no owls hooted. The only sound was the crunch of James's boots on the gravel. The tracks were rusted and overgrown, the once busy line now a path to nowhere. He set up his tripod and began taking long exposure shots, the flash of his camera briefly illuminating the surrounding trees. As he reviewed the photos, his stomach twisted. In one of the images, a faint figure stood on the tracks in the distance. A woman, dressed in a flowing black gown, her face obscured by a veil. James spun around, shining his flashlight down the tracks, but there was nothing there. Shaking off his unease, he pressed on, determined to reach the site of the derailment. As he walked, the air grew colder, his breath visible in the beam of his flashlight. The sound of his footsteps seemed to echo louder, as if the forest were amplifying the noise. Then he heard it, the distant whistle of a train. His heart raced. The line had been inactive for decades. It couldn't be real. But the sound grew louder, accompanied by the faint rumble of wheels on tracks. Ahead, through the trees, he saw it, a train barreling down the line, its windows glowing with pale, flickering light. James froze, unable to believe his eyes. As the train drew closer, he saw faces in the windows, pale, gaunt, and lifeless, their hollow eyes staring at him. The train screeched to a halt just yards away, though no sound accompanied the motion. The door to one of the cars creaked open, and the woman from the photo stepped out. She moved unnaturally, her feet gliding just above the ground. Her veil lifted slightly, revealing a face half decayed, her lips parting in a chilling whisper. "You're late." James turned to run, but the tracks beneath him seemed to shift, pulling him back toward the train. The spectral passengers pressed against the windows, their hands clawing at the glass as if eager to drag him aboard. The woman reached out a skeletal hand, her touch icy as it brushed his arm. He screamed, breaking free and sprinting into the woods. Behind him, the train's whistle screamed again, the sound deafening. He didn't stop running until he reached his car, his chest heaving and his camera swinging wildly at his side. When he reviewed the footage later, he found only static. No photos of the train, no images of the woman, just blank frames and distorted sounds of the whistle. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the passengers were still waiting for him to return and take his place among them. From that night on, James avoided the woods, but sometimes late at night he'd hear the faint sound of a whistle, growing louder and closer, until it seemed to come from right outside his window.